Hello everyone, and today on Lisa's List, we are going to speak about flood insurance and speak with a local expert, so stay tuned. Hello everyone, this is Lisa Patterson with Daniel Revenell Sotheby's International Realty in beautiful Charleston, South Carolina. And today on Lisa's List, I thought we'd talk about flood insurance. So I have Pat Condon from King Street Insurance. Welcome, Pat. I'm glad you did
Hey,
this.
good morning, Lisa.
Yeah,
Hi,
I really
Condon.
appreciate this. So as we've talked about before, it used to be my clients, when they'd come to town and look at property, first question was always, does it have parking? Now the big question is, has it flooded? Clients want to know if houses have flooded. They want to know if it floods on the street. So I thought the first thing we would talk about a little bit is flood zones and what they mean, and how, just because you are in a certain flood zone doesn't mean it's bad.
Definitely. And I get a lot of the same feedback. Folks moving here, they may see things on the news and they say, I'm interested in this property, but oh my gosh, it's in a flood zone. Um, Now, they'll get even further worried if they see it called a hazardous flood zone. And what you'll see is AE and VE are both hazardous flood zones. But to break it down a little further, A zones are very common in this area. They're really not a terrible zone. If you get into the VEs, that's your front beach. That's may have a much worse flooding problem. And to find AE and VE is a 1 in 30-year chance of a flooding event, of a major flood, where an AE zone is 1 in 100-year. So it's called a 1% floodplain versus a basically 3.3% floodplain. My house is an AE. I haven't had any problems. It is smart to vet out your zone. Like, so say your AE, the bank's going to require a flood insurance policy. So it's smart to get an elevation certificate to kind of see how the house sits on the lot. But don't panic, because I mean AE zone is very common, and it's really not something to cause worry.
Yeah, I know downtown, pretty much all of the peninsula is AE.
Yes,
Few
there's only
streets
a
are X.
very small strip of VE, and it's down near the very end, kind of like Vendu Street. And actually, most of that is changing to AE. So the peninsula, I would say, is 98% AE, as is most of Charleston. VE is really, really kind of just those barrier islands, front beach. So yeah, I mean, AE is what you're going to see downtown Charleston.
Yeah, I actually am in an AE, and as you know, so I met Pat because he had done insurance for some of my clients, and his customer service was so great, so I switched my stuff to him. And actually, I'm in an AE. I've never had a problem. My garden doesn't even flood. But the thing that I want to point out, and I tell people all the time, is when you start working with someone, whether it be your realtor or your agent for your insurance or whatever you're doing, make sure you work with someone local and that knows the market, because downtown you can have two houses side by side. I have this situation where I live where I don't get any flooding at all, but I have a couple neighbors that do. So you can have a block, and some places flood and some do not. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. And to your point about the neighbors, I've seen it before where neighbors say, "Hey, my flood insurance is too expensive. Why is my neighbor's so cheap? We're in the same zone." End up being an AE zone. And I'll say, "Well, let me guess, your neighbor's house is raised up." And then, of course, that house is 4 feet off the ground and theirs is on slab on grade. So there are different, just because you're in the same flood zone doesn't mean that you're in the same scenario. Because if you're in an AE zone and you're above what's called the base flood elevation, that means that where it's predicted that floodwaters could rise to, if you're slab on grade on this property, it'd be smart to look into, make sure the flood insurance options aren't too expensive. But if the house is raised up, or even if someone's slab on grade, but it's high enough and there's enough dirt under it, then there's really no worry. Um, so yeah, I could definitely speak to what you're saying. A local person, a local agent, able to kind of coach you on these things, like, is, first of all, what's the flood zone, and then what's the house like, what's the property like, because it may not be a worry.
Exactly. I also tell my clients too, when they're moving from another state, a lot of them will say, well, I'm just going to work with the agent for my insurance I have here. I advise them not to do that because what I find out is they get these horrible insurance quotes for flood because those people do not understand Charleston at all.
Yeah, and the thing with flood insurance is the agent, there's a lot of weight on the agent's shoulder to make sure it's rated properly, because it's not like you send it to FEMA, who does the National Flood Insurance Program, and they quote it for you. It's us quoting it. So if you're not used to quoting AE zones, BE zones, knowing what the finished floor elevation is, what's your lowest adjacent grade, there's all these different things you input. And so what happens is they may input it wrong, and it's not they're doing it on purpose. I mean, it takes a lot of repetition to get really proficient at it. So what happens is then you go to close, and if something's done incorrectly, you're going to find about it after you own the property. So it's very important to get someone that's just experienced with flood insurance, and it's not something you do every day. I wouldn't want to be doing it because there are a lot of nuances to it. And like Lisa's saying, if it's someone that's not familiar with it, we do see a lot of errors, and I do have a lot of angry phone calls. And unfortunately, once you bought the property, it's underwritten after payments made after you own the property. There's nothing that can be done. You're kind of on the hook. So it's definitely smart to do your research up front.
Exactly. Now let's talk a little bit about elevation certificates because a lot of times what I do, I always ask when I have a client that's purchasing a home if the owner has an elevation certificate. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. People think just because there's not an elevation certificate on file, they cannot get flood insurance. So explain that, they still can, but then the importance of getting an elevation certificate, most of the times it's not going to hurt you to get one.
Yes, that's a great point. So an elevation certificate will never hurt you, because if it's not beneficial, you just don't use it. But it lets you see all the flood options. So just to back up, an elevation certificate is just a document. It's done by a surveyor, and it is showing you the house and how it's, first of all, the flood zone information, and then how the house relates to the flood zone. So let's say that you're AE 13, and that's saying the base flood elevation is at 13. Well, it'll tell you where the house, how low the land is where the house sits. If it's on a crawl space, it'll give you the information for where the lowest floor is. So it lets the agent know, okay, here's the flood zone, here's how the house relates to the flood zone, and you can get quotes on it. Whether they're going through FEMA, there's also private carriers that, if it helps, I'll upload the elevation certificate information to the private flood carrier. Now, to back up even further, there are other options now besides FEMA, which traditionally was the only option. And some of these insurance carriers don't need an elevation certificate. However, it can only help. It can't hurt. So I always ask for it. It's smart to get. They cost about $400, maybe $500 to purchase from a surveyor if one cannot be found. And if you're going to be living here and you're going to be paying insurance costs every single year, why not invest in a $500 document that can only help you? Worst case is, you know what? It doesn't help, or it doesn't help at this time. It can still help in the future. It's still good to have, just so you know the elevation of your house. And if you go to sell, it's the first thing people are going to ask about anyway. So I advise just go ahead and get one if you can't find it.
Exactly. Is there anything, I know a lot of times this comes up, things that people can do to mitigate to help with their flood insurance? Like I know some of the houses downtown, they're a little higher, but they don't have proper openings per square foot, under the house, let water flow through if they are in an area that floods. So can you address that a little?
There are some things you can do. It's really a case by case basis. A good example is I actually wrote in flood insurance for a house on Kiowa this week, and on this house they were paying quite a high rate of flood insurance, which I was surprised. The house was raised up nicely, and they were paying, I expected to be $700, something like that, but they were paying several thousand. And so I looked into it. Yes, the house was raised up, but they had an elevator, and the elevator shaft went down to the ground level underneath the raised up house. And because there was no vents in this shaft, they were getting adversely rated. Well, all I needed to do was put these two tiny little vents in there, 25 square inches each. I mean, literally I don't know how handy you guys are, but it's taking a hole saw and cutting a small hole and plugging this, screwing a $20 vent in there. So I advised on that, and they got it done by their handyman, and their flood insurance went from 2 grand to 800 for 750. So it's kind of a good example. It's case by case, but sometimes we'll see by putting vents in, the flood insurance can be re-rated much more favorably. Another big thing too is just using local agent that has options, because a lot of folks are going to say, okay, I'll run it through FEMA. Here's your price. And it is what it is. I have flood insurance that's through these private carriers. So what I'll do is I'm not just going to look at one option. I'm going to look at 4 or 5, depending on where the house is. And that can greatly reduce your flood insurance costs. So, um, again, it kind of boils back to using a local person that's familiar with this, familiar with flood insurance policies.
Exactly. And that's something, that I do, because I have clients and they, they have their heart set on the house. And I've called you before and said, hey, can you run some quotes to see what
Yeah.
it's going to be, so I can advise them properly. I'm glad you brought up elevators because I was going to ask you about that. People need to realize just what you said. If they're buying a house that has an elevator, that flood insurance is going to be based on the lowest level where that elevator hits, correct?
Yes and no. It's going to affect the premium. Now, if in certain cases, like in AE zones, which are by far the most common, as long as that shaft is vented, you do get a ding. You do get a penalty. They call loading for the shaft, but it's not too bad. Now, if it's a VE zone, and it's an elevator, it's really expensive for FEMA, but I have several private flooded carriers who don't rate against the elevator. So again, it kind of goes back to just make sure you're using someone that's familiar, because there are things you can do. Definitely tell the agent about the elevator though, just so they can go ahead and address it and make sure they're putting you in the best program possible.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a lot of information for today, Pat. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can do a few more of these because there's just so many things we can talk about: homeowners, flood insurance, lots of different things we can talk about dealing with insurance. And I appreciate it. And
Absolutely.
has any questions, I'm going to have Pat's information at the end of the video. Or if you have any questions for me, give me a call, and I appreciate it. Until next time on Lisa's List.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks.